The mysterious illness from Wuhan. This video we're going to dig deeper, and of course, as usual, I am not a professional, so take this video purely for entertainment purposes only. We're going to get really deep here with the increased exposures that we're having that we really don't have. There's really no need for any kind of in terms of like what we're seeing right now with this mystery illness. And the reason I'm putting up these cards is that the way YouTube listens to these videos, they seem to push down the videos that mention certain topics. So that's why I'm being careful. That way more people can see these videos. And thank you, Miss Dana Ashley, for the clue on that. I really don't believe that this is a situation that we're facing right now where there's one disease and one cause. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the most important to understand is the problems with the RT-PCR testing that's being done. This is a real problematic test, and it's giving a lot of false positives. It's really not clear how accurate it is. The documentation for the testing literally says it's not supposed to be used for diagnostic purposes, and it shouldn't be leading to a diagnosis. So anyone that's testing positive shouldn't be counted as a casualty of some pandemic or something, but that's how it's being used. A real good overview of the problems with that reverse transcriptase PCR testing. John Rappaport did a great job of breaking that down, so I'll link that in the description of this video so you can just check that out directly, and that way I don't have to dwell on the details of why that PCR testing is such a joke, and you can get the full details from his great post on that. So moving on.
So here on the left, this is an electron micrograph, or a picture from an electron microscope of exosomes. And you can see here an exosome budding out of the cell, and it's essentially a spherical or circular, this is a cross section, so this is like a slice of the tissue, where on the periphery there are like these kind of globular densities or little dots or circles, right? And inside the cell here where it says MVB, sorry, these are the same as MVEs. That's where all these exosomes are when they're inside the cell before they bud out. Okay, and now we have a picture on the right, which allegedly shows this COVID-19 virus. And you can see that there are these vesicles budding out of the cell in a circular shape with these globular dots on the periphery. So essentially, it's the same thing. Now, you might think that this looks a little bit fuzzier on the exosomes and it looks a bit sharper in this picture. And I want to tell you that the reason for that is because when you're cutting these thin sections of tissue to make these slides, you're using this device called a microtome. It's like a vibrating razor blade. And it's technically difficult. And sometimes the tissue doesn't cooperate well, or sometimes the person is less skilled, and you might not have a perfect slice. On this COVID-19 slide, this is, I've not seen a better slice than this. It's absolutely perfect. The one on the left is a little bit thicker. And so that's why it looks a bit fuzzier and less sharp, but essentially you're seeing the same exact thing. And I want to take a look at the same comparison when we see both of them inside of the host cell. Okay, so on the bottom left here, this is a COVID-19 cell. And you see right here is supposedly this is the virus particle inside the cell. And once again, you see a circular shape. And inside, you see these round globular aggregates. Okay, now look at the top right. And this here is showing you this is less magnification. And this is actually a nerve cell. And this is the MVE. So these are a bunch of exosomes inside here. and you see a circular structure filled with these globular particles. So once again, same thing, also same size, both about 500 nanometers in diameter. Okay, you see the scale lines here, so you can see for yourself. So now we have a series of 2 comparison photographs under electron microscope of the virus and an exosome outside the cell, and a virus and an MVE inside the cell, and you can see that they are identical in appearance. So let's look at actually some physical parameters of these and continue our comparison. So I've mentioned a little bit that they are roughly the same size when they're inside the cell, same size when they're outside the cell. Now there is some variability here. I've looked at lots of these photographs, and I see in both cases there is some variability in the size. So these numbers are not precise, but in every case, they are essentially compatible in their range of sizes. Now also the receptor, now this is a key thing. Now remember I mentioned that lock and key mechanism. Well, actually with the COVID-19 papers, they have discovered that on its surface, it has a receptor for ACE2. Now, ACE2 is an angiotensin converting enzyme. It's an enzyme in our bodies. One of its functions is that it works with the kidney to regulate blood pressure, and there are blood pressure medications that inhibit this enzyme. But in this paper, what they said is that this receptor is actually how the virus invades the cells. Now, I also was able to find a paper where they've identified exosomes coming from our own body that also use the ACE2 receptor as their lock and key mechanism to find their target cells. So exosomes and COVID-19, the same exact receptor on their surface targeting the same exact cells. Now, these both contain genetic material, and it's both in the form of RNA. No DNA, only RNA. And these structures are both found in the lung fluid. So the lung cancer test that I showed you earlier found exosomes in that fluid, and the lung fluid showed the COVID-19 as well. So you can see that the more we take out this comparison forward, we see that they're essentially the same in every important way. So I happen to be looking in the virology literature, and actually they also think exosomes and viruses are possibly the same thing. So this is Dr. James Hildreth, a very prominent researcher and academic physician in the field of virology and HIV research. He's currently the president and CEO of Meharry Medical College, but he was a full professor at Johns Hopkins, and he wrote this paper with 2 of his colleagues there. And what he said, and I quote, "The virus is fully an exosome in every sense of the word." What is it that causes us to make more of these exosomes and throw them out into our circulation? So it turns out that almost every type of insult to the body would actually cause this process to occur. So toxic substances, and I found several papers looking at this. Some of them looked at environmental toxins, such as heavy metals like arsenic, and organic chemical toxins. Also found evidence about bacterial toxins, and I have a slide that I'll show you in a minute. So there's clearly has a role in the communication or possibly removal of toxic substances that damage our cells. Now, interestingly, psychological stress, including fear, which many people around the world are experiencing in a very intense way right now, also causes release of exosomes. So you see how this may cause false positive tests. This is also from the group in China. This one is published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they had a slightly different protocol, but essentially it was very similar. So what they did is, once again, they did that procedure to get the lung fluid, and then they centrifuged it and just took the fluid. So any cells from the host, like any lung cells that might be in there or bacterial cells, would would be stuck in a pellet in the bottom of the test tube, and they just took the fluid off the top, assuming that if there were viral particles, they'd be in that fluid. But they didn't actually then try to purify the virus out of that fluid. Instead, they mixed it with cells that they took from a person who had lung cancer surgery, and they incubated it with the lung cancer cells. Now, you remember I said earlier, and I showed experimental evidence, that lung cancer cells make exosomes. So when they then purified particles after incubating this fluid with the lung cancer cells and then examined them under the microscope, well, were they looking at viral particles or were they looking at exosomes? And I have two images below, and one is supposedly the viral particle from this paper, and the other is an exosome. Can you tell the difference?
Blood poisoning is another potential situation that's going on. There's a lot of different problems coming up right now, and I believe a lot of different scenarios, reasons for people getting sick, depending on the industrial air pollution that people are exposed to in different places. There's a lot of factors. Of course, as I cover in a lot of videos, electromagnetic exposure is a big factor, especially from things like that, you know. Given what we have been seeing from some of the doctors in the trenches right now, like this doctor in New York.
As New York City appears to be about 10 days ahead of the country, I feel compelled to get this information out. COVID-19 lung disease, as far as I can see, is not a pneumonia and should not be treated as one. Rather, it appears as some kind of viral-induced disease, most resembling high-altitude sickness. It is as if tens of thousands of my fellow New Yorkers are on a plane at 30,000 feet and the cabin pressure is slowly being let out. These patients are slowly being starved of oxygen. I have seen patients dependent on oxygen take off their oxygen and quickly progress through a state of anxiety and emotional distress and eventually get blue in the face. And while they look like patients absolutely on the brink of death, they do not look like patients dying of pneumonia. I have never been a mountain climber, and I do not know the conditions at base camp below the highest peaks in the world. But I suspect that the patients I'm seeing in front of me look most like as if a person was dropped off on the top of Mount Everest without time to acclimate.
The potential of this being an electromagnetic induced pneumonia-like condition. All we're speculating on is that this may be an electromagnetic syndrome that causes a breakdown and lets a virus proliferate. That's a different scenario. It's what's the cause. That's what we're searching for. I'm sure some of you have seen this. You know, what he's describing is a sickness that clearly has something to do with oxygen transport or oxygen metabolism, and these people are just not able to respirate oxygen. And this relates to some important history, which I'm going to cover here in this video, and that will really kind of tie it all together, because this is really important things to understand. I mean, if the blood can't carry oxygen, if that oxygen transport, the electron transport process, the metabolic process is compromised, then we're going to have a lot of problems. There's no question about it. Moving forward on this whole 60 gigahertz thing, I personally believe 60 gigahertz is a trap. And what I mean is that there's a lot of talk on various videos about 60 gigahertz and oxygen transport. 60 gigahertz is not needed to compromise oxygen transport and oxygen metabolism. And we know that from the history, we know that from the studies from Russia and the Soviet Union. This thing is not using 60 gigahertz yet, supposedly. So that's a trap. If we start talking about 60 gigahertz, and and that's not being used, then you're just going to get your videos discredited, and that's not what we need right now. So keep that in mind. I think it ties into this whole conspiracy bucket. You know, they want to throw that into the conspiracy bucket, and if we use 60 gigahertz, it's just going to make it easier for them to do that. Again, I believe this is a multifactorial issue going on. There's a lot of things going on, and it's not just one thing, you know. And of course, John Rappaport points that out so articulately in all of his reporting. So dig into his stuff if you haven't. He's an incredible investigative journalist for, you know, the last 30 however many years. Getting to something that's been reported in the media lately, the burning of the towers has been, you know, this is because people are pissed. You know, it's not because of some, you know, conspiracy that they think this causes that. And that's how it's being reported in the media. And this is just, it's just bad information. I mean, these people are pissed. Obviously, that's why they're doing that kind of thing, and justifiably so. I mean, these things are very dangerous, and we know that from the research that's gone on for, you know, the last as many as 80 years or so. I mean, more even. So getting back to Dr. George Beard, he was the doctor in 1869 who coined the term neurasthenia. And he was seeing this condition where there was heart palpitations and heart rate issues and anxiety and all kinds of neurological disorders going on with people that were mostly working with telegraphs in that era. And he didn't associate it right away or anything with exposure to electromagnetics. That kind of came later in history, but he was associating these symptom complexes with the particular of this occupational hazard of working with the telegraph. And so he called this neurasthenia. So it wasn't until Sigmund Freud came along, and he came along with a new term called anxiety neurosis, and basically recategorized these symptom complexes as what we know of today as anxiety disorders and things like this, which are thought to be a mental problem. So basically, because of what Freud did, the search for the cause just kind of faded away. And this is a real problem, because now, what do we have today? Today, anxiety disorders are so common, and we don't really think about it. But if you really think about what Freud did, he took what was a symptom complex and made it a cause, which doesn't really make any sense. The symptoms can't be really the diagnosis, because those are just a description of the symptoms. And essentially that's what he did, and that pretty much ended the search for the cause of those symptom complexes. Well, luckily in Russia, they didn't do that. They continued to search for the cause, and the same symptom complexes and the same occupational hazard that they were seeing, or that we were seeing, and Dr. George Beard was seeing, they categorized this differently, and they kept looking, and eventually they called it radio wave sickness, or microwave sickness eventually. few different terms for it, but they saw this as the proliferation of radio frequency technologies were developed and used by the military. They kept seeing these same types of symptoms coming up with the exposure from the operators of these technologies. So there's a lot of research out of Russia, and unfortunately a lot of it is classified. Now, some of it has been declassified. So let's take a look at some of that research. But before we get to the Russian declassified research, which is kind of limited what we really have, let's take a closer look at porphyrin enzymes and why these heme-containing enzymes and oxygen transport is so important, and why porphyrin compromised individuals, which apparently make up about 5 to 10% of the population, may be the ones that are experiencing symptoms first with exposure to electromagnetics. And it's we're not saying that the porphyrin metabolism is compromised from electromagnetics. I don't believe that has been proven at this point, but what we're saying is that the porphyrin metabolism, which is related to the overall metabolism of converting our food and into energy, a part of the metabolic process in the mitochondria, and these enzymes are essentially helping to carry oxygen and deliver the oxygen where it needs to go. And a certain population has compromised porphyrin enzyme activity, and these are probably the populations that even in the days of Dr. George Beard were experiencing the symptoms of this neurasthenia when some of their coworkers may not have, because not everyone that was exposed to these types of electromagnetics were necessarily getting the same symptoms or getting any symptoms. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, and to understand why this isn't necessarily an even playing field when it comes to electromagnetic exposure. So digging deeper into that, we can actually see the consistency in some of this research. And this is where we'll look at some of the Russian research that goes back to 1973. And this particular classified document was only declassified in 2012. It shows a lot of very interesting metabolic issues going on. And this was an animal study. So this was military. And this is where we really see some details that, it's pretty surprising that this was being studied in 1973, and right now it's being claimed that has no studies. There's they make this claim that this has not been studied for health effects. And the reason that they do that is because if they admitted that these studies were done, it would be admitting that they know the damage that it can cause. And by just ignoring it and saying that there aren't any studies, then it allows them to act like they haven't been done, even though they actually had a whole project to back historically I believe it was in the 70s, to translate all that stuff, because they were working on militarization of these technologies, and they wanted to be able to really study the research that was done in Russian and, be able to learn from that. So they translated it all. And of course it was classified for a long time. So the porphyrin enzyme compromised percent of the population, which is like about 5 to 10% of the population from the numbers I've seen, is essentially the canaries in the coal mine of this whole electromagnetic situation that's going on with increased exposure to electromagnetics. They are likely the first part of the population that's going to see exposure, that's going to see symptoms from increased exposure. And then as the exposure levels just keep increasing on the entire population, that's when, basically the rest of us will see the types of symptoms that they saw first. Biological effects of millimeter radio waves from 1977. And this was originally from Russia. This was translated and classified by the CIA and was then declassified in 2012. And this is a very interesting report by Zelebovskaya. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. I'm going to read a little section of it. The conducted investigations showed that the irritation of animals by millimeter waves caused changes in the processes of oxidative phosphorylation in the liver, kidneys, heart, and brain of the animals. The irradiation inhibited the oxygen consumption rate by the mitochondria of those organs in the active phosphorylating state and slowed down the rate of respiration upon exhaustion of the ATP. In the liver and kidneys of irradiated animals, the intensity of phosphorylation decreased by 64%. The values of the respiratory controls decreased by 26 and 28% respectively, and the changes were less expressed in the heart and brain. So it goes on to say the established disorders of the process of conjugate oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria of irradiated animals testify to suppression of energy exchange and can be a result of changes occurring in the electron transport chain. The expressed hypothesis was confirmed by the results of investigations of the activity of enzymes participating in the processes of tissue respiration. In the mitochondria of the livers of irradiated animals, the succinate dehydrogenase activity increased by 34%, and the cytochromoxidase activity decreased by 37%. Those data testify to destruction of the cytochrome chain. This was in 1977, and this is not the only research that was done on this process. And like I mentioned previously, there was a huge amount of correlation with heart disease and diabetes as the amount of electrification grew throughout the states in the United States. And prior to electrification of various states and various rural areas, the incidence of things like, and this might surprise you, but things like diabetes just literally didn't occur. And things like heart disease were very, very rare before electrification of these areas. So this is not just exposure to radio frequency, but actually just exposure to electromagnetics in general, even just from home wiring and regular municipal wiring systems. So why would that be the case? How could that be that just exposure to electromagnetics And never mind the microwaves that we're exposed to now, but just the electrification of our homes. How would that lead to such huge increases from basically nothing to a massive epidemic of diabetes and heart disease? Okay, that's where there was some really important research done by some individuals, researchers in the U.S., and they correlated some of this Russian research and basically came to the same conclusions. So let's dig into that next. Throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of research was done into electromagnetics, and this was, as I mentioned, covered in extensive detail in this book, The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg. So I encourage you to check that out if you want to dig deeper into any of these subjects. He does a great job, and it's a very well-written book. But one of the things he covers is the work of Dr. Mandel Cohen, and working with Paul White, he dug into the subject of neurasthenia in greater detail to really figure out what was going on there and exactly what was going on metabolically. And what they discovered was literally a metabolic dysfunction in mitochondrial metabolism. And what was happening was the electromagnetic exposure was literally compromising the mitochondrial process that breaks down carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, and literally causes a buildup of undigested, all of those things, fats, carbohydrates, and proteins throughout the body, fats deposited in arteries, all kinds of different problems with a lowered metabolic function when it comes to breaking down, and also lowered energy levels. And this has to do with the production of ATP, which is our cellular energy. So without it, of course, it's going to lead to any kind of condition that results in lowered energy, chronic fatigue syndrome, all kinds of things that are now pretty much considered related to, or at least electromagnetic exposure is implicated in a lot of these problems. And this, of course, goes back to Dr. George Beard and his coining of the term neurasthenia. And of course, Cohen and White sought to counter the assertion that Sigmund Freud made that this is just a mental disorder, essentially. So this goes contrary to the assertion that anxiety disorder is just something we should accept, and that there's not a real articulated cause, basically a environmental problem that we're getting from exposure to certain things, whether it's chemicals or electromagnetics. So Cohen did a great job of really, interpreting and confirming a lot of this Russian research that had been done, because a lot of that stuff was still classified at that time. Well, actually, he actually predated some of that research, but there was a lot of research going on in his time at the same time in Russia. But of course, I don't believe he had access to that, unless, who knows, maybe he spoke Russian. But yeah, it all has to do with electron transport chain, compromised metabolism of digesting, producing ATP from our essentially from our food that we're consuming, and lowered respiration. There's so many downstream problems from this this compromise in mitochondrial activity, and this really it supports the reason why diabetics often are overweight, because it's often been considered that the overweight, that someone would be overweight first and then they're more likely to become diabetic. But it could actually be the opposite, where the syndrome, which is related to a lowered metabolic function, actually may lead to the situation of being overweight because of all these undigested fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, because of a metabolic syndrome. That subject is covered extensively in other places, so I'll let you dig deeper into that elsewhere, but the mention of electromagnetics in that is often overlooked, and that's why, you know, like I said, I encourage anyone that wants to dig deeper, check out Arthur Furstenberg's The Invisible Rainbow, and you can learn a lot more there. So yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to cover in this video, and that's why I believe right now we so need to stop this. It's a really important thing that we stop this in any way that we can. That's why, like I said, I'll probably be sharing this EMF call that had a lot of really good information the other day. It was kind of a long call. So if I get enough requests for it, then I'll post it and you guys can all check it out, because we really need to do what we can on a local level to stop this, because if we don't do it now, it's going to be a lot harder in the future. So if you found this video useful and helpful, go ahead and share it with your friends, and like it and comment, share your opinion on this video, and go ahead and subscribe, and accept notifications and all that kind of stuff here on my channel. And like I mentioned, check out my other channel, Knowing the Truth, and the recent video I posted up there was a really good one, digging into the details of that Martin Pall article. And yeah, and check me out at healthharmonic.com to learn more, and we've got lots of solutions to electromagnetic problems. So yeah, check out healthharmonic.com and hit me up and say hi. And thanks again for watching this video. I will see you next time.